Hello and welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode, I'll be discussing the 2017 horror thriller movie and sequel come reboot, Jigsaw, the 8th movie in the Saw franchise, as directed by newcomers to the series, the Spierig brothers, if I've said that right. So, as per my previous reviews for pretty much all of the movies in this franchise, I will issue the same disclaimer. And what I would say is if you haven't watched Jigsaw specifically, or to be honest, any of the movies in the franchise, then I wouldn't watch this review. I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But this time around, I think this movie actually has less to do with the previous movies than most. So it's a little less important if you want to dip your toes. But I'll leave that up to you to decide that. Now, I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler-free as I possibly can, but by insinuation, I may end up giving something away. And this is a film you do kind of need to watch first off without knowing what's going to happen, pretty much as per the usual. Indeed, like I've said, indeed can be said for all of the other films in the series. However, this film is deliberately a little bit more deceptive. And so it's going to be difficult, I think, to avoid to talk about where this kind of movie goes without a spoiler or two, So, if this applies to you, do switch off now, but please do come back to SciFirst MovieTalk. I'm pleading with you, but please, and let me know what you thought of the film. I would love to know, as I do with all of the films I review. I would be very, very interested to know. So, okay, are we ready? Okay, so, this movie comes some 7 years following the last entry in the Saw franchise, and is kind of set about 10 years following the death of John Kramer, aka Jigsaw, the antagonist, if you like, from the first 3 Saw movies, and then the main kind of subject of the franchise in general, if you like, with his diabolical penchant for testing the human condition and our will to survive in the most gruesome and sinister ways possible, pitting his victims in a series of games in which they have to choose to survive, often by giving a piece of themselves, literally, in the process. So, this movie, it does serve as kind of a reboot to the series, both being connected to the franchise, but also attempting to set kind of its own path for like a potential new series following different characters and different areas of the Jigsaw universe. We do have a number of threads in this movie being followed, which kind of firstly sets up a new game being played this time around, taking a bunch of hopeful contestants, victims, who have to kind of work through a series of tasks in order to escape their forced imprisonment, facing their fears and their past, to admit their wrongdoings and the effect that they've actually had on other people around them, literally getting dragged from game to game. As the bodies begin to pile up, it would appear whoever is kind of executing these games this time around has an intimate knowledge of Jigsaw's methods and is actually brazen enough to put these perished victims on display for all to see. And indeed, we do have a nice new pool of suspects to choose from. We actually then follow a new team of investigators, if you like, on the outside of the games, namely embittered and hardened Detective Halloran, as played by Callum Rennie, his partner, Detective Keith Hunt, as played by Bennett, and the 2 pathologists examining the evidence in an effort to track down the killer, Logan Nelson and Eleanor Bonneville, as played by Matt Passmore and Hannah Emily Anderson, respectively. So, just who is actually kickstarting Jigsaw's work after all of these years? What is the motivation behind the macabre games once again? Will our team be able to put a stop to the tyranny once and for all? So, what I would say for me is that, and I'm not going to tell you the answers to those questions, but for me is that whilst this may not actually reach the same levels as some of the better movies in the franchise that we've seen already, it still offers up a fresh enough approach, I think, and an intriguing story that it does rank it well above some of those at the bottom of the pile. It certainly moves along at a fairly decent pace, with a number of interesting characters, and with a few twists and turns up its sleeve, and that whilst I don't think it will entice too many new fans to the fold, it does a decent enough job for those that have kind of followed the series, or, you know, even those that have kind of perhaps watched some of the early ones and then maybe switched off a bit later on. So Jigsaw, you know, this brings a bit more of a contemporary flair into the series with a more modern feel. In terms of its overall story, its look and its music, they all seem a little bit more polished, yet noticeably edgy still. Everything seems kind of upgraded to fit with a more modern and discerning audience, shall we say. Although, you know, at least they didn't set it in space. I won't lie, I think it does actually use a couple of cheap tricks to make you believe the impossible. And I must admit, it did actually throw me the first time I watched it. But I think in the end, when you kind of weigh up the events of this movie after the fact, whilst not entirely separate from the series, but at the same time not also quite a full sequel either, it serves as kind of a pretty clever and reasonably decent way to kind of bridge the past with the present. In fact, I would actually say that this one is actually better on a second viewing, as it actually does let you savour the events in much, much more detail once you know what's going on, and you can kind of set that to the back of your mind a little bit and then concentrate on the things that you missed, rather than kind of getting caught up in its deliberate kind of off-the-hand trickery, you know? Whilst I actually do think it is a fresh take, I can see that for many, this would appear to be kind of a tired old rehash of some of the previous elements of the franchise. Most notably, the main game itself, which indeed is admittedly yet another group game, you know? As we have seen in so many of the previous films. But for me, the game appears more focused in this installment, and indeed as if it was almost evolved as it was being played, with the overall rationale and the focus of this entry feeling more personal to Jigsaw, really, than ever before. The cinematography is brighter, it's less dingy dungeon than the movies in the original series. Yet its contemporary feel, it doesn't stop it from feeling part of the series either. Of course, this is actually helped by a few nice surprises along the way, not least the return of Billy the Puppet, who himself looks even more sinister than usual. I do like the investigative kind of puzzle box approach that we have in this movie, you know, taking some of the elements that I thought worked best in the previous movies, with this one having as much of a compelling story outside of the game as within. So the forensic element, the forensic investigation elements, you know, they add quite an intriguing and captivating quality to the proceedings. They don't go quite far enough for me personally. I would have loved to have more of an in-depth investigative approach in this movie. It would have been fantastic. But even on a repeat viewing, when you know what's going to happen, I think it's these elements that actually then lean on our inquisitive nature and aid in including us on the journey to discovering just who is behind these diabolical games this time around. It's not exactly CSI quality, you know, but enthralling enough nonetheless. It also brings more of John's story to the fold, but this time, unlike the last few installments that we've had, it actually works, I think. And even though, yes, yet again, it's more coming out the woodwork, seeming kind of just to fit in for a brand new film, at least this actually seems somewhat plausible and feels connected. Even though, agreed, we never have had kind of any insinuation of the events and the items in this film's overall plot in any other movie. Perhaps, if you look closely enough, bar for a very brief moment in the last installment, Saw 3D. The movie also carries forward the Saw legacy with its own unique series of traps, as they all have done. And whilst I would say that it features probably some of the more simpler traps of the series that we've kind of seen up to this point, they are still very ingenious. A couple are indeed superb. But overall, I would say that they kind of seem more mechanical in nature, if that's more possible. More intricate, perhaps, on a personal level. Not the best ever, but still particularly gruesome. I would say perhaps some of the most suspenseful that we have. Overall, I would admit that this movie is not on a par with the original. But it is an entertaining entry, you know, for anybody who's kind of enjoyed the series as a whole. And even then, you don't really need to have seen any prior movie to enjoy this entry at all. Just a general understanding, you know, i.e. there's a killer called Jigsaw who plays these gruesome games. That alone was going to get you by in this movie. There are some excellent nods to the franchise in general, but it's not blatant, you know, it's not in your face. There's just enough to kind of pique your interest as you're going along without it feeling laden or misplaced, if you like. The ending might not be particularly 100%. It's a bit preachy, and you know, you don't necessarily get all of the answers that you would kind of hope for. It is a little bit mixed in terms of its overall message, but it is one of the more coherent entries in the series, I think, that we've kind of had for quite some time. It is individual enough, I think, to bring in a whole new series of fans. Do I think it's strong enough to do that? No. Well, no, not at all. I think it's fairly generic when all's told in that respect. It's nothing outstanding. But at least, you know, for the most part, it's fresh enough when you compare it to the rest of the series and kind of removed enough to remain interesting for the most part with this, with it, you know, its own bevy of detectable twists and turns. So, that brings me to the end of this episode. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions, and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you here at SciFirst MovieTalk, and we would definitely love to have you back. But most of all, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.